The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as Charles stood in his private study, staring at the ancient oak desk that had belonged to his mother. The weight of the crown felt heavier than usual today, not just the physical gold and jewels, but the responsibility that came with being King of England. His hands trembled slightly as he held a letter that had arrived with the morning post, its contents threatening to unravel everything he had worked to build since taking the throne. Camilla entered the room quietly, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet. She had been his companion through decades of public scrutiny, his wife for nearly 20 years and now his queen consort. Her presence usually brought him comfort, but today something felt different. The morning light caught the worry lines around her eyes, lines that had deepened since they had taken on their royal duties together. "You've been standing there for an hour," she said softly, approaching him with the careful grace she had learned over years of royal protocol. "The staff is beginning to worry. Your breakfast has gone cold twice." Charles didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he continued to stare out the window at the sprawling gardens where tourists were already gathering, hoping for a glimpse of royalty. These same people who now looked up to him had once whispered about his divorce from Diana, about his relationship with Camilla, about whether he was fit to be king. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very person who had been his greatest source of controversy was now standing beside him as his queen. "You ever wonder what would have happened if we had made different choices?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them like morning mist, heavy with unspoken memories. Camilla moved closer, close enough to see the letter in his hands. She recognized the handwriting immediately, though she hadn't seen it in years. Her heart began to race as she realized what this meant, what storms this simple piece of paper could unleash upon their carefully constructed life. The castle around them continued its daily rhythm. Servants went about their duties, gardeners tended to the roses, and somewhere in the distance the changing of the guard continued its ancient ceremony. But in this moment, in this room, time seemed suspended as two people who had fought for their love against impossible odds faced a new challenge that threatened everything they held dear. Charles finally turned to face his wife, and Camilla saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Not the uncertainty that had plagued him during his younger years, not the determination that had carried him through his mother's death and his own coronation, but something deeper and more frightening. It was the look of a man who was being forced to choose between his personal happiness and his duty to the crown, a choice he thought he would never have to make again. The letter contained information that could destroy not just their marriage, but his reign as king. Someone from their past had decided to speak, to reveal secrets that had been buried for decades. The timing couldn't have been worse, coming just as Charles was beginning to find his footing as monarch, just as the British people were starting to accept Camilla as their queen. "We need to talk," Charles said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. He set the letter down on the desk and gestured toward the two chairs by the fireplace, where they had shared countless quiet moments over the years. These chairs had witnessed their hopes and fears, their plans for the future, and now they would witness what might be the most difficult conversation of their marriage. As they sat down, the morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but the warmth it should have brought was absent from the room. Instead, there was only the cold reality of what lay ahead, the knowledge that their world was about to change in ways they couldn't control or predict. Camilla reached for Charles's hand, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. But today she felt him hesitate before taking it, and in that brief moment of uncertainty she knew that whatever was in that letter was serious enough to shake the very foundation of their relationship. Charles cleared his throat and began to read from the letter, his voice growing weaker with each word. The contents were more damaging than Camilla could have imagined. Someone who had worked closely with them years ago was threatening to publish a tell-all book, claiming to have photographs and recordings that would prove Charles had been unfaithful to Camilla during their marriage, not with another woman, but in his duties as king. The accusations were specific and detailed. The former palace insider claimed that Charles had been secretly meeting with foreign dignitaries without proper protocol, making promises about British policy that he had no authority to make, and using his position for personal financial gain. None of it was true, but the evidence had been cleverly fabricated to look authentic. Camilla felt her world tilt on its axis as the implications became clear. This wasn't just an attack on Charles's character, but on the monarchy itself. If these allegations became public, it wouldn't matter that they were false. The damage to the royal family's reputation would be irreversible, and Charles might be forced to abdicate the throne he had waited his entire life to inherit. "We can fight this," Camilla said, trying to inject strength into her voice. "We have the best legal team in the country. We can prove these allegations are false." But Charles shook his head slowly. "By the time we prove anything, the damage will be done. The press will have a field day. Every headline will question my fitness to rule. The government will lose confidence in the monarchy. We've seen what scandal can do to this family." He was right, and they both knew it. The royal family had weathered many storms over the decades, but in the age of social media and instant news, even false accusations could spread around the world in minutes. The court of public opinion was swift and merciless, and once trust was broken, it was nearly impossible to rebuild. Camilla studied her husband's face, seeing the weight of generations of royal tradition pressing down on his shoulders. She had known when she married him that their love would always compete with his duty to the crown, but she had hoped those days were behind them. Now, sitting in this room filled with portraits of his ancestors, she realized the crown would always come first. "What does this person want?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Money, of course, but not just money." Charles looked up from the letter, his eyes meeting hers. "They want me to make a public statement distancing myself from certain political positions. They want me to change who I am as king to become a puppet for their agenda." The demand was clever and cruel. If Charles gave in to blackmail, he would be compromised forever. But if he refused, the false accusations would destroy everything he had worked for. It was a trap with no easy escape, designed by someone who understood exactly how to exploit the royal family's greatest vulnerability: their need to maintain public trust and respect. Outside the study windows, tourists continued to snap photos and point at the castle walls, unaware that inside those walls, the future of the British monarchy was hanging in the balance. Guards stood at attention, maintaining the pageantry and tradition that had defined this institution for centuries. While behind closed doors, that same institution faced its greatest threat in decades. Camilla stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the people gathered below. These were the people Charles served, the citizens whose respect and loyalty kept the monarchy alive. She thought about all the royal duties they had performed together, all the hospital visits and charity events, all the times they had tried to show the British people that they were worthy of their trust. "We can't let them win," she said, turning back to face Charles. "Whatever the cost, we can't give in to blackmail. It would set a precedent that would haunt the monarchy forever." Charles nodded, knowing she was right, but also knowing the personal cost of that decision. If they fought this battle, their private life would be dragged through the mud. Every detail of their relationship would be examined and criticized. The stress might destroy their marriage even if they ultimately proved their innocence. The irony was bitter. They had already survived decades of public scrutiny and emerged stronger. They had won the acceptance of the British people through patience, dignity, and genuine service. Now, just when they thought they could finally enjoy their life together as king and queen, they faced a threat that could take it all away. As the morning wore on, advisors began arriving at the castle for emergency meetings. Word was spreading through the palace that something serious was happening, though the full details were being kept strictly confidential. Charles and Camilla found themselves at the center of a growing storm, making decisions that would affect not just their own lives, but the future of the British royal family. The emergency meeting in the palace's private conference room felt like a war council. Around the polished mahogany table sat the most trusted advisors to the crown: the private secretary, the press secretary, the head of security, and the family's longtime legal counsel. Each face showed the gravity of the situation as Charles explained the blackmail threat and its potential consequences. Sir James Morrison, the private secretary who had served the royal family for over 30 years, was the first to speak. His weathered hands clasped tightly in front of him as he considered their options. "Your Majesty, we've dealt with scandals before, but this is different. The timing is particularly unfortunate, coming so soon after your coronation." And the press. Secretary, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen Patterson, leaned forward. The media landscape has changed dramatically in recent years. Social media amplifies everything. Even if we prove these allegations false, the initial damage could be catastrophic. We need to consider getting ahead of this story. Camilla sat quietly beside Charles, her hands folded in her lap, but her mind was racing. She had learned over the years to read the room, to understand the political undercurrents that drove palace decisions. She could see in the advisors' faces that they were already calculating the costs and benefits of different strategies, and she feared what conclusions they might reach. The head of security, a former military officer named Colonel Davidson, spoke with characteristic directness. We need to identify the source of these threats. If we can discredit the blackmailer, we can discredit the accusations. My team is already investigating. But the legal counsel, an elderly man who had guided the family through numerous crises, shook his head grimly. Even if we expose the blackmailer, the damage to His Majesty's reputation could be lasting. The public doesn't always distinguish between accusations and facts. We need to consider all options, including the possibility of a strategic retreat. The phrase strategic retreat hung in the air like a death sentence. Everyone in the room understood what it meant, though no one wanted to say it aloud. They were discussing the possibility that Charles might need to abdicate the throne to protect the monarchy itself. Charles felt the walls of the room closing in around him. He had spent his entire life preparing for this role, had waited over 70 years to become king, and now it might all be taken away by lies and manufactured evidence. The injustice of it burned in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm and consider what was best for the institution he served. "What about fighting back?" Camilla asked, breaking her silence. "What if we go public ourselves, explain the situation to the people directly? The British public has shown remarkable wisdom over the years. Perhaps they would see through these false accusations." Sir James looked uncomfortable with the suggestion. "Your Majesty, with respect, that would be extremely risky. It would mean acknowledging the existence of these allegations, which could give them more credibility. Once we open that door, we lose control of the narrative." The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the impossible situation. Outside, life at the palace continued normally. Tourists took photos, guards changed shifts, and staff went about their daily duties, unaware that the future of the monarchy was being decided in this room. Helen Patterson cleared her throat. "There is one other consideration we haven't discussed. The blackmailer's demands aren't just financial. They want to influence policy, to essentially control aspects of His Majesty's reign. If we give in to this, it sets a precedent that could attract other blackmailers in the future." This observation struck at the heart of the matter. The monarchy's independence and dignity were just as important as Charles's personal reputation. If they capitulated to blackmail, it would fundamentally change the nature of the crown, turning it into a tool for whoever was clever enough to manufacture scandal. Charles stood up and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. He could see gardeners working among the rose bushes, maintaining the beauty and order that had been cultivated for generations. The sight reminded him that he was not just a man facing personal attacks, but a custodian of an institution that belonged to the British people. "I need time to think," he said without turning around. "I need to consider this carefully with my wife. We'll reconvene this evening." As the advisors filed out of the room, each carrying the weight of this crisis, Camilla remained seated at the table. She knew that Charles was wrestling with more than just a decision about how to handle blackmail. He was questioning everything he believed about duty, sacrifice, and the price of wearing the crown. When they were alone again, Charles returned to his seat beside her. For a moment they sat in silence, two people who had found love later in life and now faced the possibility of losing everything they had built together. "Whatever we decide," Camilla said softly, "we decide together. We've come too far to let someone else tear us apart." But even as she spoke these words, she could see the doubt growing in Charles's eyes, and she feared that their greatest test was yet to come. That evening, Charles and Camilla walked through the palace gardens as darkness fell around them. The familiar paths that had provided comfort during countless previous crises now felt different, as if the very ground beneath their feet had shifted. Their security detail maintained a discreet distance, allowing them the privacy they desperately needed for this conversation. "I keep thinking about my mother," Charles said as they paused beside a fountain that had been a wedding gift to Queen Elizabeth decades earlier. She faced the Suez Crisis, the troubles in Northern Ireland, the fire at Windsor Castle, Diana's death. She weathered every storm with such dignity and strength. "I wonder what she would do in this situation." Camilla took his arm gently. "Your mother had the advantage of time and experience. She learned to navigate these waters over 70 years on the throne. You've only been king for a short while. You're still finding your way." But Charles shook his head. "That's just it, though. I don't have 70 years to figure this out. Every decision I make now sets the tone for my entire reign. If I handle this wrong, if I appear weak or compromised, it will define everything that comes after." They walked further into the garden, past the ancient oak trees that had stood sentinel over royal conversations for centuries. Camilla could feel the weight of history around them, the echoes of all the monarchs who had faced impossible choices before them. But she also felt something else, the growing distance between herself and the man she loved. "Charles," she said, stopping and turning to face him, "I need you to tell me what you're really thinking. Not as the king, but as my husband. What's going through your mind?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the stars that were just becoming visible in the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. "I'm thinking that maybe this is a sign. Maybe I was never meant to be king. Maybe the fact that our love has caused so much controversy over the years was the universe trying to tell us something." The words hit Camilla like a physical blow. She had suspected this was where his thoughts were leading, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that terrified her. "You don't mean that," she said, though she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. "Don't I?" Charles asked, his eyes meeting hers in the moonlight. "Look at what our relationship has cost already. The scandal when I divorced Diana, the years of public disapproval, the damage to the monarchy's reputation. And now this. Maybe it would be better for everyone if I stepped aside." Camilla felt tears stinging her eyes. "Better for everyone except us. Better for everyone except the man who has dedicated his entire life to serving his country. Charles, you're letting fear and exhaustion cloud your judgment. This blackmailer wants you to feel exactly this way, wants you to doubt yourself and your right to be king." But Charles had moved beyond her reach, both physically and emotionally. He walked to the edge of the garden where a high wall separated the palace grounds from the outside world. Beyond that wall lay the real world, where people lived their lives without the crushing weight of royal duty, where love could exist without public scrutiny and political calculation. "Sometimes I wonder what our lives would have been like if we had just been ordinary people," he said. "If we could have met and fallen in love without dragging an entire institution into controversy." The fantasy was seductive, Camilla knew. She had indulged in it herself during the darkest periods of their relationship. But she also knew it was dangerous thinking for a man who wore the crown. "We can't change the past, Charles. We can only decide what to do with the present." He turned back to her, and in the dim light from the palace windows, she could see that he had reached some kind of decision. The realization filled her with dread. "What are you going to do?" she asked, though she feared she already knew. "I'm going to protect the monarchy," he said simply, "even if it means protecting it from myself." The words hung between them like a death sentence. Camilla understood now that Charles wasn't just considering abdication as a last resort. He was beginning to see it as the noble thing to do, the ultimate sacrifice for the institution he had served his entire life. "And what about us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What about our marriage? What about the promises we made to each other?" Charles closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, she saw a resolution there that broke her heart. "Maybe that's the problem," he said. "Maybe I've been trying to serve two masters, the crown and my heart. Maybe it's time to choose." As they walked back toward the palace in silence, Camilla felt their world crumbling around them. The blackmailer had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They hadn't just threatened Charles's reputation. They had planted seeds of doubt that were now growing into a decision that could destroy everything she and Charles had built together. The palace loomed before them, its windows glowing warmly against the night sky. Inside those walls, their staff continued to work, planning state dinners and royal engagements, unaware that their king was contemplating a decision that would change everything. The weight of that responsibility, of all those people whose lives depended on the stability of the monarchy, pressed down on Charles's shoulders like a mountain. As they reached the palace doors, Camilla made one last attempt to reach the man she loved. "Whatever you decide," she said, "please don't decide tonight. Please don't let fear and exhaustion drive you to a choice you might regret for the rest of your life." But Charles had already begun to withdraw from her, and she could feel him slipping away with each passing moment. The following morning brought no relief from the crisis. Charles had spent the night in his study, poring over constitutional law books and historical precedents, while Camilla lay awake in their bedroom, staring at the ceiling and wondering if their marriage was about to become another casualty of royal duty. When she finally found him at dawn, still sitting at his desk surrounded by dusty volumes and legal documents, she knew that he had made his decision. His face had the hollow look of a man who had wrestled with his conscience all night and emerged defeated. "You're going to abdicate," she said. It wasn't a question. Charles looked up at her with eyes red from exhaustion and unshed tears. "I've been reading about the constitutional process. It's actually quite straightforward. I would need to address Parliament and the nation, explaining my decision to step down in favor of William. The transition could be managed smoothly." Camilla sank into the chair across from his desk, feeling as though the ground had opened beneath her feet. "And us? What happens to us?" "We could finally be free," Charles said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We could travel, spend time with the grandchildren, live a normal life without the constant scrutiny and pressure." But Camilla could see through his words to the pain beneath them. Charles had never wanted a normal life. He had been raised from birth to be king, had spent decades preparing for this role, had developed passionate opinions about architecture, environmental conservation, and social justice precisely because he expected to use his position to make a difference in the world. "You would hate it," she said bluntly. "You would hate watching from the sidelines while William deals with issues you care deeply about. You would hate being the king who gave up, the one who let a blackmailer drive him from the throne." Charles flinched at her words, but he didn't deny them. "Maybe that's the price I have to pay for choosing love over duty all those years ago. Maybe this is the consequence of putting my personal happiness above the good of the monarchy." The statement revealed the depth of his guilt and self-doubt. Camilla realized that the blackmailer's attack had tapped into wounds that had never fully healed, doubts that Charles had carried for decades about whether his relationship with her had damaged the institution he was meant to serve. "Charles," she said, leaning forward across the desk, "look at me. Really look at me. Do you honestly believe that our love has been a mistake? Do you think the happiness we've found together has made you a worse king or a worse man?" He met her eyes, and for a moment she saw a flicker of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. But then the weight of his royal training reasserted itself and the walls went back up. "What I believe doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is what's best for the country and the monarchy. And right now that seems to be my stepping aside before this scandal destroys everything." Camilla stood up abruptly, anger finally overriding her sadness. "So that's it? You're just going to let them win? You're going to throw away everything we've worked for because some criminal with fake evidence decided to attack us?" "It's not that simple," Charles protested, but Camilla cut him off. "It's exactly that simple. You're letting fear make your decisions for you. You're letting guilt about the past cloud your judgment about the present. This isn't wisdom, Charles. This is cowardice." The word hung in the air between them like a slap. Charles's face went white and Camilla immediately regretted speaking so harshly. But the damage was done. She had said what she was thinking and there was no taking it back. "Perhaps you're right," Charles said quietly. "Perhaps I am a coward. Perhaps that's why I'm not fit to be king." The pain in his voice broke Camilla's heart, but it also ignited her determination. She had spent years supporting this man, believing in him when the world doubted him, standing by him through every crisis and controversy. She wasn't going to watch him destroy himself now. "No," she said firmly. "I was wrong to call you a coward. You're not weak, Charles. You're exhausted and overwhelmed and carrying the weight of centuries of tradition on your shoulders. But you're not weak." She moved around the desk to stand beside him, placing her hand on his shoulder. "The Charles I married wouldn't let a blackmailer drive him from his throne. The Charles I love would fight for what he believes in, even when the odds seem impossible." For a moment she thought she had reached him, His hand came up to cover hers, and she felt some of the tension leave his body. But then he pulled away, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked the palace courtyard. "Maybe the Charles you married was an illusion," he said. "Maybe I've been pretending to be stronger and more capable than I really am." Camilla watched him standing there, silhouetted against the morning light, and realized that this crisis had stripped away all his defenses and forced him to confront his deepest fears about himself. The blackmailer had succeeded not through evidence or threats, but by attacking Charles's fundamental sense of self-worth. "I have something to tell you," she said suddenly, making a decision that she knew could either save their marriage or destroy it completely. "Something I should have told you yesterday when this all started." Charles turned to look at her, curiosity momentarily overriding his despair. "What?" Camilla took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything between them. "I know who's behind the blackmail, and I know why they're doing this to us." Charles stared at Camilla in shock, the words hitting him like a physical blow. "You know who's behind this? How could you know and not tell me?" Camilla's hands trembled as she clasped them together. She had hoped this moment would never come, that the past would stay buried forever. But now, with their marriage and Charles's reign hanging in the balance, she had no choice but to reveal the truth. "Because it's someone from my past," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone I thought was gone from our lives forever." She moved to the chair and sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than her years. "Do you remember Marcus Whitfield? He worked for the Palace Press Office about 15 years ago, during some of our most difficult times with the media." Charles's face went pale as the name registered. Marcus Whitfield had been an ambitious young man who had seemed dedicated to protecting the royal family's reputation. He had been particularly helpful during the period when Charles and Camilla were facing intense scrutiny about their relationship, offering creative solutions for managing negative press coverage. "He was dismissed for breach of trust," Charles said slowly, the memories coming back. "He was caught selling stories to tabloid newspapers." Camilla nodded miserably. "What you don't know is that before he was caught, before he was dismissed, he and I—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't bring herself to say the words that would shatter everything between them. Charles felt the room spinning around him. "You and he what, Camilla?" "We had an affair," she whispered, the words falling into the room like stones into still water. "It was brief, it meant nothing, but it happened. He was charming and persistent, and I was feeling lonely and neglected during that period when you were so focused on your royal duties. It was the biggest mistake of my life." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. All the color had drained from his face, and Camilla could see him processing this revelation, understanding now why the blackmailer's threats had been so specific and devastating. "He has evidence," Charles said, his voice hollow. "Photos, recordings, proof of your affair." "Yes," Camilla admitted. "He was already selling stories to the press back then. He documented everything, thinking it would be his ticket to wealth and influence. When he was dismissed, he kept the evidence, waiting for the right moment to use it." Charles buried his face in his hands. The betrayal cut deeper than any political scandal or public controversy ever could. This was personal, intimate, a violation of the most sacred trust between husband and wife. But even worse was the realization of what this meant for his reign. "If this comes out," he said slowly, "it won't just be about corruption or abuse of power. It will be about my wife's infidelity. The press will tear us apart. The monarchy will become a laughingstock." Camilla reached toward him, but he pulled back, unable to bear her touch in that moment. "Charles, please, let me explain. It happened during the worst period of our relationship, when you were considering whether to marry me at all. You were so distant, so focused on your duty, and I felt like I was losing you. So you turned to another man," Charles said bitterly. "You turned to someone who was already betraying our trust, who was selling our secrets to the highest bidder." "I was weak and foolish and scared," Camilla said, tears streaming down her face now. "I was terrified that you were going to choose duty over love, that you were going to decide I was too much of a liability. Marcus seemed to understand me, seemed to offer the emotional support I wasn't getting from you." Charles stood up abruptly and walked to the window, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Outside, the world continued its normal rhythm, but inside this room, everything had changed. The foundation of trust that their marriage was built on had cracked, perhaps irreparably. "How long?" he asked without turning around. 3 months. Camilla answered quietly. It ended when I realized what a terrible mistake I was making, how much I was risking for something that meant nothing. And you never thought to tell me? In all these years, through our engagement, our wedding, our time as king and queen, you never thought I deserved to know? I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid you would leave me, afraid it would destroy us. The affair was over. Marcus was gone from our lives, and I thought the secret would die with time. Charles turned back to face her, and Camilla saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than anger or hurt. She saw cold calculation, the look of a king making a decision about what was best for the crown regardless of personal cost. Leave, he said quietly. What? Camilla wasn't sure she had heard correctly. Leave, Charles repeated, his voice growing stronger. Pack your things and go. I need time to think, and I can't do that with you here. The request hit Camilla like a physical blow. In all their years together, through all their struggles and controversies, Charles had never asked her to leave. They had faced everything together as a team, as partners who had chosen to build a life despite the obstacles. Charles, please don't do this. Don't let him win. Don't let this destroy us. But Charles had already turned away from her, his decision made. I said, leave, Camilla. I need space to figure out how to handle this crisis, and I can't think clearly with you here. As Camilla stood to go, her legs shaking beneath her, she realized that the blackmailer had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He hadn't just threatened their reputations. He had destroyed their marriage with a truth that had been hidden for far too long. 3 days passed in agonizing silence. Camilla had retreated to their private country estate, while Charles remained at the palace, surrounded by advisors and constitutional experts who were preparing for what seemed like an inevitable abdication. The palace staff moved through their duties with unusual quiet, sensing the gravity of the situation even without knowing the full details. Charles spent his time walking the palace corridors alone, past portraits of his ancestors who had faced their own crises and scandals. He thought about his great-uncle Edward VIII, who had abdicated for love, and wondered if history was about to repeat itself in reverse. A king abdicating because love had proven to be his weakness rather than his strength. On the 4th morning, Sir James Morrison arrived with news that changed everything. He found Charles in the library, staring blankly at books he wasn't reading, and announced that their investigation into Marcus Whitfield had yielded unexpected results. Your Majesty, Sir James said carefully, we've discovered something important about Mr. Whitfield's evidence. It appears that much of it has been fabricated. Charles looked up sharply. What do you mean? The photographs he claims to have of Her Majesty can be proven to have been digitally altered. The dates and locations don't match palace records from that time period. Our technology experts believe he created false evidence to support whatever real material he might possess. For the first time in days, Charles felt a spark of hope. Are you saying the affair didn't happen? Sir James hesitated. No, sir. We believe the affair did occur, based on other evidence we've uncovered. But Mr. Whitfield has greatly exaggerated its scope and significance. He's fabricated most of his supposed documentation to make the situation appear far more damaging than it actually was. Charles processed this information slowly. The betrayal was real, but the threat was largely manufactured. Camilla had been unfaithful, but not to the extent that Whitfield claimed. The revelation didn't heal the wound to his marriage, but it did change the political calculation. There's more, Your Majesty, Sir James continued. We've also discovered that Mr. Whitfield is facing serious financial difficulties. He's desperate for money, which explains both the blackmail attempt and his willingness to fabricate evidence. We believe we can discredit him completely if we choose to fight this publicly. Charles stood up and walked to the window where he had spent so many hours contemplating his future. The gardens outside were in full bloom now, a reminder that life continued even in the midst of crisis. For the first time since this ordeal began, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that he might not have to abdicate after all. What would fighting back require? He asked. A coordinated media strategy, legal action against Mr. Whitfield, and full transparency about the real facts of the situation. It would mean acknowledging that Her Majesty made a mistake many years ago, but also proving that the current threats are based largely on lies. The path forward was clearer now, but it still required Charles to make a fundamental decision about his marriage and his reign. He could fight the blackmail and save his crown, But what about his relationship with Camilla? Could he forgive her betrayal? Could he trust her again? That afternoon, Charles made an unexpected decision. Instead of summoning Camilla back to the palace, he drove to their country estate himself, arriving unannounced as she sat in their garden reading. She looked up as his car pulled into the drive, hope and fear warring in her expression. "I know about the fabricated evidence," he said without preamble as he approached her. "I know that Whitfield created fake documentation to make your affair appear worse than it was." Camilla set down her book and looked at him directly. "Does that change anything between us?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "It changes the political situation. We can fight this and win, but it doesn't change the fact that you betrayed our relationship and kept it secret for years." "No," Camilla agreed quietly. "It doesn't change that." They sat together on the garden bench where they had shared so many peaceful moments over the years. The silence between them was heavy with unresolved pain, but also with the possibility of healing. "I've been thinking about what you said," Charles finally spoke, "about choosing between love and duty, about letting fear drive my decisions. You were right. I was ready to throw away everything we've built because I was afraid and hurt. And I was wrong to keep this secret from you," Camilla replied. "I was wrong to let fear keep me from trusting you with the truth." Charles turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time since this crisis began. He saw the woman who had stood by him through decades of public scrutiny, who had helped him become a better king and a better man. He also saw someone who had made a terrible mistake and had been living with the guilt and fear of it for years. "If we're going to fight this together," he said slowly, "if we're going to save our marriage and my reign, we need to be completely honest with each other from now on. No more secrets, no matter how painful the truth might be." Camilla nodded, tears streaming down her face. "No more secrets. I promise." As the sun set over their garden, Charles made his final decision. He would return to London, he would fight the blackmail, and he would remain king. But more importantly, he would work to rebuild the trust in his marriage that had been shattered by secrets and lies. The crisis that had threatened to destroy everything they held dear had also given them an opportunity to create something stronger and more honest than what they had before. It wouldn't be easy, and the scars would take time to heal, but they would face the future together as they always had, with truth as their foundation and love as their strength.